Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. As trailblazers in formally linking Jewish studies with social justice, JSSJ is excited to announce the first ever graduate-level certificate in JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. This unique program gives professionals the opportunity to learn from scholars and activists, offering a blend of academic study and real-world application. So whether you want to expand your knowledge for personal development, boost skills and techniques in your classroom, or bring in valuable JEDI skills to your organization, this program will give you all the necessary tools and resources. Fall classes begin on August 27th. Learn more and apply now at usfca.edu/JEDI.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 383, Jews of Summer Camp, A History. Alternative title, This One Time at Jew Camp? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And if you've been following the podcast week after week, you know that we just wrapped up this series on the Bar Mitzvah, its history, and its future. And one thing that came up a lot during our conversations about the Bar Mitzvah, in particular the future of the Bar Mitzvah, was summer camp. And there are some camps like Camp Tawonga, which we talked about a few weeks ago, where they are really creating brand new ways to think about the Bar Mitzvah more globally and actually have Bar Mitzvah programs of their own. We thought, especially since this time of year is the time of year where lots of Jewish kids start going off to camp, lots of families start bringing their kids to camp. You may be listening to this podcast in your car on the way to bringing a child or multiple children to camp. So it would be interesting to spend a little time this week talking about Jewish summer camps. And sure enough, one of our old friends of the podcast, Sandra Fox, recently published a book about Jewish summer camps. So it makes a lot of sense to have this conversation with Sandy. You may remember Sandra Fox from episode 206. That was part of our Yiddish series, where we talked to her, among other things, about her Yiddish language feminist podcast called Weiberteich. But who knew that she was also an expert in Jewish summer camps? Her recently published book, entitled The Jews of Summer, Summer Camp and Jewish Culture in Post-War America, explores the origins of Jewish summer camps and the interplay between the intentions of those adults who founded and ran the camps and the children and teenagers who were campers and worked at the camps and shaped the summer camp experience perhaps just as much as the adults that founded the camps, as is still the case. We're really excited to jump into this conversation with Sandra Fox to find out more about the story of Jewish summer camps and, in a certain way, the story of American Jewish childhood and teenagerhood, which nicely builds on the conversations we've been having over the last few weeks. Our guest today, Sandra Fox, is the Goldstein-Gorin Visiting Assistant Professor of American Jewish History at New York University, NYU. And she is the director of the Archive of the American Jewish Left in the Digital Age, which sounds like a future podcast topic. Sandra Fox's research interests include American Jewish history, the history of youth and childhood, Yiddish culture, and the history of sexuality. Sandra Fox received her doctorate from NYU's Joint History and Hebrew Judaic Studies program in 2018. Sandra Fox, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you again.
It's great to be here again. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, we're really excited about somebody writing a book about camp, right? About Jewish summer camp, which feels like such a central experience that you figure that the origin story of it must be the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness and that we've been camping ever since. And yet, it's reminding me of our conversations a while ago about the origin of the bat mitzvah, that there are actually these things that you think of as being constituent parts of Judaism that are actually of much more recent vintage than that. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the story of how summer camp did become a central part of the American Jewish experience.
Yeah, well, it definitely goes back a good bit to the beginning, kind of the early 20th century. But it really took off more so in the post-war decades. And that's why my book focuses more on the period right after World War II. So what you have earlier in the 20th century, you have camps for children of immigrants, later on second-generation Americans. A lot of them are nonprofit camps. They're operated by settlement houses and other organizations that serve immigrant children. By the 20s, you have camps that are operated by Yiddish institutions like what's now the Workers' Circle. So you have these building blocks in the early 20th century. Also, there were camps for more of the middle class Jews, Jewish boys in particular, whose families came earlier in the 1800s. But there's this moment in the post-World War II era that as Jews are becoming more socially mobile, more affluent, moving to suburbia, the summer camp, which had existed for quite some time, became more important. And it's also a time of increasing anxiety over the future of Judaism. And so the summer camp, which, like I said, did exist prior to the 1940s, 1950s, starts to take on the importance that I think a lot of Jews know of it today, right? There's this idea around that Jewish summer camp can solve communal issues. It can solve assimilation. It can solve intermarriage. We assign the summer camp a lot of meaning and a lot of mission. And that is something that began more so in the late 1940s, 1950s, and then just increased over time.
So I loved reading your book, and there were so many pieces that spoke to me on a Jewish level and with respect to my own camp experience, etc. I wanted to start in a not Jewish space. Camp is an educational environment, or at least it's largely framed as an educational environment. It's also other things. But Jewish institutions, including those that you profile in your book, see camp as a place to teach certain things, to teach just factual information type things, to learn languages in many cases, but also to teach sort of principles or values aligned with various Jewish movements or otherwise. I wanted to start, though, with the fact that this is an educational environment and with sort of a backing out process. We have not talked about a figure that I think is really important for Jewish life because he's not Jewish, but John Dewey. He's a guy who you mention a few times in your book. He's not like the protagonist or a central figure, but his philosophy of what education is and how we might best go about it seems to have a really big influence, not just on Jews, but especially on those who were forming these early camps. So can you talk to us about that? Like, how might we conceptualize what camps are even doing when Jews are going to them and then like experiencing a set of educational programs?
So camps are educational environments. Although I would say most camps that aren't the kinds of Jewish camps I profiled, they don't have a lot of frontal education or sort of factual education. There's more about, skills like outdoor nature skills, self-reliance, creating, independent children who could be away from their families, different kinds of nature skills. You have camps for Christian congregations and the such, but I don't see study being as central to a lot of those camps. Some of them, yes, some of them, no. But what all of American camping kind of has in common is a relationship to John Dewey and to democratic education, because pretty much all different kinds of camps came at some point to view themselves in a way as miniature democracies, little miniature republics where kids could learn different skills that would be applicable in American life, good citizenship, teamwork. So Jewish camps are not unique in drawing on the concept of democratic education and the idea of play as a form of education. What they do that is unique is really take these kinds of American progressive educational ideologies and transform them to fit their Jewish ideologies. One of the chapters is about play in the summer camp. And one big feature of play at summer camp is role play and what was also called by some people sociodrama. I started to do some research of where this idea of sociodrama came from, and it can be ascribed to this kind of a philosopher. I think he might have been a psychologist, but like his background is really interesting. He also worked with actors in Vienna. His name was Jacob Marino. He was Jewish, and he was also in touch probably with a lot of different Jewish educators and educators like Dewey. And so this concept of sociodrama was basically catharsis through role play, but on a group scale. So there's this idea of psychodrama that still exists. That's like one-on-one, you can do with a psychologist, but sociodrama is on a bigger scale. So it was really interesting to see how that theory came into Jewish summer camps. They used the word sociodrama to talk about role plays where campers would role play, let's say, one of the Israeli wars or a moment in the Holocaust even, and to do that sort of towards a point of like collective memory and also in some cases catharsis when you think about things like the Holocaust. So Jews are using this very, very American tool to achieve specific Jewish goals.
So I'd love to dwell there for a little bit with sociodrama. I mean, I never as a child going to camp knew the word sociodrama, or even as a counselor. But when I read that part of your book, I was like, whoa, this was a huge day-to-day. Like, I knew what it was as you were telling it to me. I knew it in my body, not with words. Because I went to a summer camp, a Jewish summer camp. Shout out Interlochen JCC. I hope some of y'all are listening. And we absolutely, there were role plays, there were sociodramas that were deeply similar to what you described in your book. I mean, we did the thing of late at night, pretending you're under the cover of night, trying to get into the land of Israel as an immigrant, which many camps did and which you described in your book. I don't remember any explicit Holocaust like reenactments. I do remember pogrom, like pretending we experienced ourselves pogroms in Russia and like role playing some of that, counselors being Cossacks or people trying to scare us in various ways. By the way, these are all like really questionable methods. Some people might support them. Some people might not. You get into some of those debates in the book. But more than that, it wasn't just I realized that a typical evening program on a typical night, like we were role playing something or another multiple times a week at summer camp. It was so core to the experience that I didn't even realize it was like a modality that people had chosen to use. To me, that was just like, oh, that's what summer camp is. Like every night, counselors are dressed up as some new kind of thing, and you're doing a themed activity where you play something else. So I guess I am curious, though, to like get into the nitty gritty of those. What are some of the common forms of sociodrama that played out, pun kind of intended, at camps? And like, to some extent, how were they a little different in the four different kinds of camps that you profiled?
Yeah. So, I mean, role play is a really good way of going to really the heart of my book's argument. What I'm really trying to show is that all of these different kinds of Jewish camps, and the ones I focus on are Zionist camps, Yiddish-oriented camps, Reform camps, and conservative camps. They are basically trying to take the suburban American child that's never known anything but kind of socioeconomic comfort, very little anti-Semitism in comparison to other times of other places, and make them be closer to so-called authentic Jews, either past in places like, Eastern Europe, or in the present in Israel, or in the recent past in Palestine or Israel. And so all of their role plays really reflect their ideologies very directly. Zionist camps they had the most robust programs, I would say, in the 40s, 50s, 60s. They had the most robust programs when it came to kind of this experiential role-playing type of education. I did find examples even where they did share between camps ideas of what kinds of role plays they could do, and eventually shared them with camps like JCC camps and just broader Jewish camps overall. So that's how a lot of Zionist role plays ended up in camps like JCC Interlochen, probably, and also became a part of, Reform camping and conservative camping as well. Like I said, be role-playing various wars. It could be role-playing illegal immigration to Palestine. That was very common. Setting up a kibbutz or, a yishuv against the will of the people around you, the British and the Arabs, respectively. And also they would do sometimes Knesset role plays too, to really understand the various parties. Yiddish camps did not do as many of those kinds of role plays, although I found a lot of pictures of kids in costume as Jews from the past. So I would find, they're in the book, some of them, pictures of this is really interesting because a lot of these camps are secular camps, right? These are camps that say like, we are not interested in Judaism as a religion. This is all about secular Yiddish culture. And yet I found so many pictures of children and teenagers dressed up in like Hasidic garb. One great picture of a girl dressed up as a man in Hasidic garb, and another girl with like a pillow under her belly as a pregnant traditional Jewish mom role. And so there is something going on where there's role play, but it might be more directly actually on stage because Yiddish had this whole tradition of theater to draw on. At Zionist camps, I also found former campers. I didn't find documents about this as much, But from Zionist camps, I heard from campers that there were role plays, kind of what you described, more so of pogroms and other things like that, less so the Holocaust, but also some days that did sound to like they kind of got closer to the Holocaust. And of course, I value people's memories, but also these details were blurry for many of the people I spoke to. You know, there was an emotion left over, but the details of which exact event they played, it's a good, you know, we can't really know. And then reform camps, I saw some really creative ones that drew on other parts of Jewish history, and also were maybe ahistorical, like debates between different rabbis that may or may not have happened. I found one that, you know, Camp Gucci, one of the reform movement's summer camps, I found a document about them creating their own platforms, like the reform movement created the Pittsburgh platform. So I think the camp is in Zionsville, which is funny that it's in Zionsville, but so they had the Zionsville platforms. So that's an example of some sort of role play, but it's not necessarily directly based on the history. It's sort of taking the history and moving it in a different direction. And I saw also role plays of immigration to America. And that was really interesting and refreshing for me because I didn't see a lot of examples in other kinds of camps about sort of celebrating or even remarking upon American Jewish history. And maybe we can get into that a little bit later when we talk about contemporary stuff, because I've had conversations with contemporary camp leaders about what would it be like for camps to be a little bit less focused on Israel? What if we talked about American Jewish history? And it's sort of like, oh, that's a thing. Reform camps did that a little bit. And stuff that had to do with the shtetl and all sorts of things like that. The camps that I saw the least evidence of this in the archives, although it definitely could have happened and probably did happen to some extent, were the Ramah summer camps of the conservative movement. Those camps had a lot more frontal education, at least in the post-war period, than the other camps I dealt with. And so they relied less on experiential. There were really fascinating debates that I found about, you know, the question of how much you should be trying to give children facts versus kind of create emotional learning. So certainly I do imagine that certain Ramah camps in certain years, role plays took place. And I know that they did for people closer to my age. So there must have been some sort of evolution over time away from more of the frontal and more towards the experiential, including role play, but it didn't seem to be as big a feature.
Well, on the subject of Ramah camps, it reminds me of one of the most profound reading experiences I've had. And there was an article written by Seymour Fox who wrote about the early days of Camp Ramah. And it was incredible. Like he had recruited Bruno Bettelheim and Joseph Schwab, these, you know, great philosophers of education and psychology, and that they were somehow involved in the planning for Camp Ramah. Like it was I found it kind of mind blowing. And you walk away from that saying, wow, this is amazing. I mean, probably this camp invented the most incredible thing ever. And then I started to think about it a little more, and I was like, that wasn't exactly how I understood what was going on at Camp Ramah from my friends who went there. You know, I didn't go there growing up, but I'm wondering, I guess, if the visions of the people who founded these camps or tried to build in these educational approaches, whether they were achieved, or I don't think a lot of us think Jewish summer camps are bad, but it's more like maybe it was a different experience than the one that the people in charge intended. And I'm wondering what you discovered in that analysis.
Yeah, love that question. So for a little background, I did my PhD in American Jewish history, but my secondary field was the history of childhood and youth. And that field is pretty small, and it's been very focused on questions of agency. Do children actually have agency in their lives? And thus, can we look at them as agents in the making of history? And that whole conversation can get kind of tired. I won't take you through every little element of where that conversation's gone in the field. I was really excited to take that approach of thinking about the perspective of children and teens in camp and using it to study Jewish summer camp. Because what I found, it's not like I'm the first researcher to study Jewish camps. I'm very lucky that many amazing scholars have already looked at aspects of this topic, but very few of them looked at it from the perspective of how children and youth experienced it. And also, how did they shape it? Because actually, campers and young people, counselors are also very young, so we count them as youth. They are the vast majority of people in these camps. There are the people who plan them, that envision them, but campers have tremendous power in their decisions to go along or to roll an eye, to attend activities or to skip them, to speak languages like Hebrew and Yiddish or to not speak languages like Hebrew and Yiddish. So that has been a huge part of my agenda. I don't think I've overstated their power either. I think that it's just kind of I was the first person to have the opportunity to look at it from these dual angles, both the top down and the bottom up. It's interesting also, you bring up Ramah. A camp's archives say a lot about how it viewed this dynamic, how much power it allowed young people to have or was comfortable with young people to have, and how much they didn't really want to acknowledge that power. I haven't lived at these camps in the post-war period, like halavai. I wish I could go back in time in a little, my little time machine and go there. But the archives tell you a lot, and the alumni tell you, the people I spoke to told me a lot about the vibes of these different camps. They have very different vibes. The Ramah Archive vibes is a camp of adult educators who sought to have a lot of educational control over the situation. When they gave campers control, they tried to do so in a very orderly and planned way. Like they would have democratic experiments, quote unquote. Some of the Yiddish camps, on the other hand, it seemed like they were very freewheeling. They had camper newspapers that made fun of the camp, that debated the camp's core ideologies. You see that a lot with Zionist camps as well. So they actually are on this like very, very fascinating spectrum. And Ramah gets a lot of attention in the Jewish camping world and also in the scholarly, in the study of camping, because it is a wonderful camping movement. And it's done a lot for the kind of the overall Jewish camping movement and setting a lot of, I don't want to say standards, but being a model of how Jewish education could run. And I did talk to former campers who said they didn't feel like they were empowered at Ramah. It was not that way with the Zionist campers or the Yiddish campers who kind of felt like they were running the show. They weren't. It's the same way student government doesn't really run the school, but some camps were better at giving campers an illusion of power. I would love Jewish educators to come away from this book thinking differently about camps as institutions, thinking about that bottom up a little bit more.
By the way, I used to do some work for the Foundation for Jewish Camp, and I would visit camps, and sometimes you would go to a camp like Ramah, which is kind of like how you're describing it. Like there's a lot of adults there. They're doing a lot of adult things and things are kind of under control. And then there were certain camps, not to name names, that I would text my wife, like, it's sort of like a Lord of the Flies situation here. Not in a bad way, but, you really see, like, is there any adult even at this camp? Totally. But I think I'm wondering more broadly, do you think that camps have been largely successful at achieving what they were trying to set out to achieve, or they have been successful, but at achieving something other than what they were setting out to achieve?
Camps are constantly moving their benchmarks of success. So I don't even know what success means anymore. I don't mean that to be like salty or to diss camps at all. I just think, first of all, some of the more contemporary notions of success are very political, to me at least, right? They have to do with curbing intermarriage, which I don't think is the neutral proposition that a lot of Jews think or thought it is. It's a political one. A lot of camps also have the goal of creating supporters of Israel in very normative ways. So I'm kind of skeptical of a lot of the different markers of success that people who studied camps have used in the past. But there are several examples of moments in which the things that adults wanted to happen didn't happen because young people didn't want them to happen. And that caused not a view that camps were unsuccessful, but it caused the benchmarks of success to move. So language is a really prime example. A lot of different camps in the post-war decades were they had some kind of language agenda. They either wanted to be fully Hebrew speaking, as was the case at Camp Masad, which was a Hebraic Jewish summer camp in the Poconos with multiple locations. Ramah tried to be kind of similar to Masad, but very quickly it understood it wasn't going to be fully Hebrew speaking the way Masad was. And the Yiddish camps also became actually more Yiddishist, more ideologically pro-Yiddish and working to upkeep Yiddish in the decades after World War II because Yiddish was in decline. So they had these language ideologies, but they were facing American kids and American teenagers and American counselors who were teenagers or early 20s, who either didn't speak those languages at the levels that the camps hoped they did when they arrived, so they couldn't do what the camps wanted and speak more Hebrew and Yiddish, or they just weren't interested. It just didn't speak to them. My colleague Sarah Benor has written about Hebrew infusion in the Jewish summer camp, and there was this great book, Hebrew Infusion, about the way camps use Hebrew now, infusing it into the environment. It's not an effort to speak it fluently, but rather to use it here and there for words in the environment, for group names, etc. That wasn't what camps wanted per se in the beginning. Many, many camps had more robust visions of the roles of those languages within camp life, but they had to move the benchmarks of success because it didn't work for young people. And that is really the story of camping. And camps continue, I think, to have to be responsive to the needs, desires, and interests of the young. That's how they've continued. They change over time for that reason, and they rejudge their visions of what success means in response to that.
I really love this piece that came up first in your intro and then really was a thread throughout the whole book about how histories of Jewish camp have centered on a very small minority of the people at those camps, in particular, the directors and a certain set of educators in Jewish contexts that might be making choices about curricula or whatever. It touched me on a few levels. One, because you're talking about a context I care a lot about, Jewish camps. I spent a lot of time at a camp, and on a day-to-day basis, truly, sincerely, I'm not trying to be a rebel. I'm not trying to power to the people. I think what happens on a given day at camp really is not in the hands of the directors, of the people that are theoretically in charge. I don't think that's true. And I don't think they think it's true. There's whatever visions, there's whatever goals, but you've got however many 100 kids, you've got however many dozen staff, they're doing a bunch of things at once, and you are trusting, and you're not overseeing them all the time. It's kind of this microcosm of a Jewish world where it's like a fantasy land. What if there weren't adults around in some context? I mean, my bias is I spent time in a camp that was more towards the mayhem side of the spectrum. When I learned that other camps even had guest educators that would come, and I was like, wait, really? We had one Jewish educator on staff that would do their best, and the rest of the Jewish educators was the counselors or the campers educating each other. But the piece that speaks to me more is not just the campsite. I think this is a model for how we tell Jewish histories more broadly. Because if we were to talk about the ways that synagogue histories are told, that's about the rabbis. It's about maybe the synagogue presidents. It's not usually about the people in the pews. It's especially not about the people that are members and not in the pews on any given week. And I think you're kind of giving us a teaching. Maybe we should be telling all of our Jewish institutional histories, our collective Jewish narratives, in a way that doesn't just center the people who have authority positions like director before their names. So I guess I'm curious about that, and a little just if you can give some color to the mayhem, to the rebellions. What did it look like when campers exercised power in particularly marked ways, or when counselors did even?
Yeah, thanks for saying that. And I'll just say I did this really creative book launch where I made a month of Jewish summer camp happen in one night at Congregation Bethel Heman Park Slope, and I was the camp director. So after all of these years about writing about these dynamics at camp, I had this whole vision of what was going to happen in executing a month of camp in one night. And it was chaos, and I couldn't get it to go exactly how I wanted. And then I said, this is perfect. This is exactly how camp was. It brought me back to being a staff member at camp and remembering there's what you had on the piece of paper, your pula, your activity, and there's what actually happened. And that's
it's an improv
kind
game.
of, it's an improv game. Absolutely. Absolutely. Every element of it is. And then my camp director from Camp Tell Yehuda came up to me, he's like, not so easy, is it? It isn't easy. It isn't easy at all. It was very funny. I really appreciate what you said. And, I'll just say that the history of youth and childhood came out of this broader thing called the social history turn in the 1970s. And I won't go too deeply into it, but that's the same time that you get histories of women and other kind of marginalized groups in history. And so we don't think of young people as marginalized because everyone's young at some point in their lives. But from the perspective of history, we don't really look at the young practically at all. I would say Jewish history in particular has been reluctant to do so because there's so much focus on rabbis and directors and sort of this intellectual history, even in the case of Jewish education, where, of course, most of the people being served are young people. So on that note, you asked about examples of the mayhem. I alluded to this earlier, but camps set themselves up as little miniature democracies, in part to teach about American democracy and in some cases about Jewish forms of democracy, like within Israel or the Bund. They would have these asefas or asefot, these assemblies, to use the Hebrew word, where campers would be able to give their feedback or say what they wanted, either representatives of the campers or the entire camper body. But what that's really about, I mean, that is about education to some extent, but it's also really about giving campers a sense of freedom. Because actually, it could feel very oppressive. Your parents drop you off and you're in this environment where you're all of your time, and the entire space is dedicated to a camp's, in this case, an ideology, right? These are not purely recreational spaces. How do you keep kids under control, especially adolescents and teens? They have to feel like they have had a say in how their transformations within that space occur. There's this element of giving campers the sense of freedom, whether that's in camper newspapers where they would write, raunchy or lewd humor or make fun of the camp or criticize the camp, even debate issues that had to do with the camp's ideology, or, in activities like raids. One of the reasons I have memories from camp of our counselors helping us execute a raid, making us feel like we had this chance to do something wild, but really also controlling it. And that is, whether people realize it or not in the moment, that is about striking a very specific balance between allowance and control. Campers need to feel like they are freer at camp than they are at home or at the school, so that they will love camp and take on the ideologies and the identities that camps promote freely, as if it was their own accord to do so. This sounds like I'm saying this is nefarious. I don't think this is nefarious. This is just how education, I think, works, and how education in a recreational space works in particular. When I first started finding funny scraps of paper, camper newspapers, weird little letters and stuff, I thought that those were besides the point. I was like, no one's going to take me seriously if I include this in my dissertation. At that point, it was a dissertation. And I was 20 something and a woman in academia. So I was really worried about no one taking me seriously because, no one did for a while. That's how that goes. So I put those aside and I made an anonymous blog. I don't think it's still on the internet, but I'll check. It was called P.S. I Lost My Blue Hat, which was a quote from a letter a camper wrote to his mom that said, P.S. I lost my blue hat because the poor kid lost his blue hat. And there I would put up all these funny bits I found. And then when I started to understand that the fun and the mayhem of camp is part of how they succeed, quote unquote, how they succeed at passing on ideology and creating an environment of free choice and of joy, I came to understand that they were actually the point. They were not besides the point. They were the entire point. The other place where a lot of that stuff could be found is in romance and sexuality. In the past couple of years, there's been a lot of conversations about camps and Jewish youth movements as spaces that are hypersexual, even promoting rape culture, and we can talk about that. But that all prompted me to look for, how did this begin? Fears about Jewish continuity, about intermarriage, did not begin in the 40s and 50s, not at all. And I'll be very clear that wasn't a part of camp's agendas at the time. Although they did like to encourage marriage within a specific kind of Jewish group, maybe you'll find your spouse at Camp Kinderland who's a fellow communist Yiddish speaker Jew. But still, there's always a prehistory. And I did find that is a longer story, and that partly does have to do with this whole thing of needing to create an environment of freedom. Camp leaders knew that campers arrived pubescent or post-pubescent and desiring of romantic relationships, in these cases all heterosexual, as of what I know of, because basically no one I could find was out in the post-war years. They knew that they were coming there for those sorts of relationships and those experiences, and allowing them space and time to have those relationships and to touch each other. To touch each other contributed to making camps feel like free environments, and that actually served the educational goal. I hope I'm not making camps sound nefarious. I really don't think they are, because this is like explaining how it happened.
So I think I'm interested in a number of avenues with the question that I want to ask, which is partly what happened to American Judaism in the past because of camp, and also what maybe is happening to camp in the future because of the past of camp. But I'm thinking a little bit about these stories that I've heard, and I guess I've heard them from a number of different camps, so I thought of them as maybe apocryphal, but turns out that I think it's true, that around the holiday of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which is the day on the calendar where we mark the destruction of the temple in Jewish history, And this is not a majorly well-known holiday in the liberal denominations of Judaism. So I think that this story depends, for the most part, on the campers not knowing that it was Tisha B'Av. And the counselors or whoever do this activity with the campers one day where they build up some kind of fort or some kind of really cool creation. And then they go back to their bunks. And then the next morning they wake up to go do some more work on the fort. And they arrive and it is completely destroyed and in pieces and just completely gone. And the kids are all upset. And the counselors say, and now we will teach you about Tisha B'Av, about the stories of Jewish history where what we have built was destroyed. And there's so much to ask about in terms of this story. I mean, number one, is this like a version of the mayhem that really part of what's going on here is hazing and cruelty, a version of the Lord of the Flies situation? Or is this really a really effective educational technique that perhaps has actually made this under-observed Jewish holiday of Tisha B'Av something that American Jews know about in a way that they might never have known about? And that kind of shows in a certain way the potential of camp, both because of the time of year when it takes place and also the kind of experiential education that you have there to really build up people's experience of Judaism in ways that wouldn't have happened if camps hadn't been around. And I guess the other part of that question is just saying, as I think a lot of us hear this story and say, that's pretty awful. I don't like that story, whether camps don't really do that kind of thing anymore, or they do.
I can't speak to whether camps still do that or not. I mean, I know they did when I was a child, and I'm 34, but that's a long time ago still. So I don't know. I have to imagine they're not doing things like pogroms, but I don't know. I truly don't know. I know they're still doing like Israeli military simulations at a lot of camps and day schools and stuff. And that to me is very odd, given, gun violence in this country, just the whole idea and also things about Israel. But so Tisha B'Av, I cannot emphasize enough how much material I found about Tisha B'Av. In some camps' collections, easily 25 to 40% of what they kept had to do with Tisha B'Av, or in the case of some Yiddish secular camps, an alternative Holocaust memorial type day that they created that took on different names, which really goes to show from the perspective of the people who created these archival collections or donated these files to places like the Center for Jewish History, the American Jewish Historical Society or YIVO, they believed Tisha B'Av and its alternatives, its secular alternatives, to be of the most important things they did all summer, if not maybe the most important thing they did all summer educationally. They had a lot of control on Tisha B'Av. I mean, that's just a day where you strip away all the recreation, kind of strip away the freedom and the mayhem too, because it's not appropriate to have that. And you have a captive audience. I mean, captive, haha, it's kind of funny, right? Because they are literally captive. They can't leave. There's nowhere to go.
Yeah. But
they have this audience where children are learning about horrible things in Jewish history, often for the first time. And it's a somber day where they're processing these moments of Jewish history and the sadness in an environment that's talking about the need to reconstitute or change Jewish culture in America because it's not, authentic enough. And that's why they're looking towards Israel. They're looking towards the past in Eastern Europe as a guide for authenticity. So these are incredibly emotional experiences, especially when we think about just the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust. And I found examples of camps doing Tisha B'Av commemorations in 1944 when the war is still going on, and referencing the concentration camps. So it was happening very, very early. And educators, they got right on board with using Tisha B'Av. I mean, this is exactly what you're saying. It was not a common practice in most liberal denominations, most families, to mark Tisha B'Av at all. But the fact that it was the only holy day in the whole summer calendar and that it could be molded so easily to a camp's ideologies and politics made it a perfect activity to bring into the camp environment, despite how incongruous it was with the rest of the camp environment, which is like joy and recreation and fun and play.
So what you just said about how it's counter to the camp general vibe of joy and play, I mean, to me, to slightly disagree and slightly agree, I think the defining characteristic of camp isn't the joy or the play. It's like committing to the bit. It's like committing to whatever the vibe is for the day. You choose a vibe, and the vibe can be mayhem, the vibe can be joy, the vibe can be a theme that you choose, but you're committing to the bit fully, and you're getting everybody to. And so the bit for Tisha B'Av is deep sadness and mourning. And we're going to have the lights off in the evening program, and we're going to have just a couple candles in the middle, and we're going to sit on the floor. What's funny is a lot of Tisha B'Av practices that are not just for camps. I actually think that, like, if you plopped some camp educators in a room and said, come up with some rituals for what you would do on a day of mourning, I think they might come up with candles and lights off and sitting on the ground and not eating or eating less. But I think that that's part of it. I also, people often bring up how Tisha B'Av is the only holiday in the summer, which is part of why it caught on at camp. I do think that's part of it, but I always like to point out, like, Rosh Chodesh happens during the summer, right? Like there's the beginning of a new month. And I think there could be a parallel universe where camps do really interesting things with the beginning of new months, and then those translate back into Jewish spaces. I know less about that. I have seen less of that, even though it kind of fills a gap of Jewish holidays that is only filled by Tisha B'Av besides that. So I think it's more about the features of Tisha B'Av. It's about the fact that it's mourning. It allows for this catharsis, this set of, like, I don't want to say simulated because it's real, like, but dwelling in deep mourning, learning about the past. I do think it's more about that than it is like that it happens to be the only holiday in the summer.
I want to just say, I completely agree with you. I think it's both the circumstance that it's in the calendar already and the fact that it was useful. I want to pull a quote from Levi Schleyer, who is a Jewish educator people don't know enough about. We talk about Jewish educators and leaders a lot in Jewish history and in Jewish education, but a lot of times the Yiddish ones people don't really know as much about, but he was a really important Yiddish educator. And he wrote about Tisha B'Av that it was a day for the, quote, comfortable American youth that understand little about suffering to prepare our children in the struggle for their own creative survival, a struggle which, incidentally, is rendered more acute in its severity in conditions of freedom. And he said, a little suffering goes a long way, which is the name of the chapter. So absolutely agree with you. I just wanted to pull that out because sometimes hearing from the horse's mouth is effective.
Yeah. And by the way, part of why I bring that up is because I think other smaller holidays that are in the summer, like, run with them, people that are at Jewish, like, do a Rosh Chodesh. Like, I think it's funny that we haven't, honestly, or I shouldn't say we, that to my knowledge, most camps have not. But I wanted to ask a related thing, which is you hint and to some extent explicitly talk about how camps just change what Judaism is outside of camp. One of the best examples you give of this is in the Reform camps. If you want to talk about the history of Reform Jewish music, I think you are required to talk about Jewish summer camps. I don't know how you could tell that story otherwise, because the last, you'd have a better sense of the precise number of decades, but I'll say the last five-ish decades of Jewish music, literally the main soundtrack of that movement were created by a set of people who first got their feet wet at Jewish summer camps. Debbie Friedman, Jeff Klepper, Danny Freelander, a beloved past guest of ours. Like, these are people who tried some new things that were for a Jewish camp context. And then, like, turns out Jews outside of camp aren't necessarily so different from Jews at camp. And you can use those melodies in a synagogue or in whatever other context. So I'm kind of curious about other examples of how camp isn't just sort of a receptacle that receives ideologies of movements and then, like, molds people to whatever they are. It's actually its own actor, doer in the Jewish ecosystem that can actually play a really big role in changing how a Jewish holiday in Tisha B'Av's case looks and how many people care about it or don't, or, you know, the literal melodies that people choose to sing in their Jewish spaces.
Definitely. Okay, so you mentioned Reform song leading as a great example. Absolutely. Another place you see it is in the conservative movements that the Ramah camps really functioned as an experimental space for Jewish practice, for ritual, for davening, for prayer, and also a place where women had more opportunities than they did in the conservative movement at various times to lead prayer and other rituals. It basically was ahead of the conservative movement on that front and was part of what pushed the conservative movement to become more egalitarian. Those are huge. I'll start with a slightly lesser known one or less obvious one, and then a really less obvious one that I want people to know about. So Zionist camps, obviously, they were the first to kind of use Zionism in the camp context to transform children's identities. It wasn't just about learning about Israel. It was using Israel as an ideological tool to fashion one's own Jewish identity. They started that, and a much wider variety of Jewish camps came to take on the same idea. Jewish summer camps are one of the most important reasons that American Jewish culture became not only pro-Israel and very Israel-oriented, but really Israel-centric in terms of what it thinks of as Jewish culture. That the kinds of practices within Jewish camping of singing Israeli songs, singing the Israeli national anthem, and doing Israeli folk dances, they were existing in suburbia before camps were, as camps were doing them, but they really spread through camps. And this kind of, there's an Israel centrism of American Jewish education that we can link back to this post-war moment where educators realized that Israel could be a transformational tool. It could inspire Jewish kids to be proud of their Judaism. And that made a lot of sense back then when you think about it's right after the Holocaust and they have to figure out a counterbalance to all of that suffering and tragedy, Israel. And then the Yiddish camps. There were dozens of camps that were oriented, not just that they spoke some Yiddish, but they were oriented towards Yiddish culture in some way, shape, or form, and often touted socialist or communist ideologies related to Yiddish institutions and labor movements and the like. Those camps basically all closed in the early 1980s, except for Kinderland and Kinderring, which still exist today, but they're not as Yiddish oriented at all as they were in the past. What I would say is that even though a lot of the Yiddish camps I studied no longer exist, the symbiosis that occurred in these camps between adults and children and teens and counselors, it created a new use for Yiddish in the 20th century in America. At a time when fewer and fewer American Jews spoke Yiddish, it had bigger symbolic value. So a lot of the Yiddishism we see that's popular today, especially among a lot of young people who are diasporist in orientation, maybe disaffected by the kind of Israel centrism that I was just talking about, I think that we owe it, that is all owed to what Jewish summer camps created in the post-war decades. And that has had a life well beyond their closures.
I have a bit of a wild card, strange question. I don't think this is something that came up in your book, but I find myself feeling called to it. Jewish camp operates in an interesting way, which is to say, when people can check a box of went to Jewish summer camp, I think that people take that as conveying a set of attachments to Judaism that is interesting. When I want to explain what I mean. Like, I'll read an article sometimes and it'll be about a celebrity. Oh, Ben Platt. He went to Ramah. And it's
He's
like this,
put
your hands up in the air. It's used in this way. I think part of it is people are curious about the background of celebrities, but it's used in this way of he's one of the legit ones. Mm-hmm. He's not one of those silly celebrity Jews who doesn't care. So this is all in quotes. I don't mean any, he's not one of the celebrity Jews who's just sort of Jewish in name or whatever. He went to Jewish summer camp. It's used in this way that is meant to prove something. Same with Seth Rogen. He went to Havonim. I know these top of head because I feel like all the articles in Jewish publications about these people, they do this maneuver. Sarah Silverman, she went to Jewish summer camp. I'm curious, what you would say is happening there. And I don't think it's unique to Jewish camps. I think sometimes we do the same thing with, they went to Jewish day school. They went, what am I supposed to take from that? I went to summer camp. There's plenty of people I know who went to Jewish summer camp who are now rabbis or now Jewish educators. There's plenty of people I know who actively don't want to touch Jewish stuff. And there's plenty of people in between. It doesn't convey anything about the person to say that they went to Jewish summer camp, but somehow we get this thing in us, and I'll say it for myself, I feel nice when I read those articles too. It tells us something about that celebrity that they're one of us, to quote you, that is interesting to me. Like, what might be happening there, and what are some broader dynamics that it's shedding a light on?
I mean, I think it sheds a light on the fact that camp Jews see themselves as a particular kind of Jew, and maybe I don't want to say this, I don't believe this, but better than other kinds of Jews. I think that's an experience that unfortunately people have when they go to like Hillel, when they get to college. If they didn't go to Jewish camp, it's like, well, you didn't go to Jewish camp. How can I place you? Mm-hmm. We don't know any people in common if you didn't go to camp. We don't have a shared context. So I think what happens when we hear about celebrities that went to Jewish camp, it gives you this feeling of, oh, I know something about them. We have this shared experience, even though you might not have. I mean, of course, all these camps have a lot of differences too. I will say that it's interesting as someone who just wrote a book about Jewish camp. I don't really care about celebrities who went to Jewish camps, but then all of a sudden I'm getting interest in making a film about Jewish summer camps or a documentary. And suddenly you realize that the fact that there are all these camp Jews in the media actually is relevant to my life now. Do I get a book to Ben Platt's dad? Because apparently he's a producer and related to this other producer I'm talking to. I mean, and again, probably nothing will happen out of any of this, but the fact that campy Jews also functions a little bit like fraternities or sororities might, it's like a way that you connect to other Jews, even if they're not from the same camping movement, that can work of like, there's this shared experience. And of course, all those things can be lovely and they can also be really bad and create inequality.
But shout out to Ben Platt's dad if he's a Judaism Unbound listener.
Yeah.
Yes, we're happy to schmooze sometime. There you go. Just to say, you already said this, but just in case it wasn't fully understood by some listeners, like the inequality, like Jewish camps cost money. They cost a lot of money in a lot of cases. There are some avenues to scholarship money, but like a certain set of people with a certain set of intersectional identities, usually white, usually upper middle class to upper class, tend to be higher represented at Jewish summer camps. Mm-hmm. And that's not to say that makes Jewish summer camps evil or the people who go to them evil. Like, all of us have shared positive associations with them, but that's part of what's operating when the person is at Hillel and they feel ostracized. They might not just be feeling ostracized or separate from the group because they didn't go to a camp. It might correlate with also being not part of the group in other ways.
Yeah.
So I'm really, really grateful for this conversation. I guess just as we close, I'm curious if you just have any parting thoughts or words, maybe a parting chant or like cheer to be in the Jewish, I don't know, you don't have to do that, but to be in the camp theme. What would you leave people with as they hopefully immediately go to buy your book online and read the whole thing? But like, what's a key takeaway for them as they go on to whatever's next in their life?
I think if you're an educator or you're a parent, you're thinking about being a parent or you thinking about being an educator, one thing I hope my book inspires people to do is to think more from the perspective of children and young people. And to think about their power in various situations, educational situations, family situations. I don't think we do it enough. We're very, very blind to we know their desires, like when they want something like a toy or food or whatever. We don't think about the dynamics between the ages in the way that I think my book does. And hopefully that'll inspire people to think about that. I'd be really interested to hear from people who work in Jewish education about if it's made them see something differently, or maybe they have pushback and they don't see it my way. And that's totally cool too.
Thank you so much, Sandra Fox, for joining us. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to close out this episode as always, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. We love getting your questions, your ideas, your visions, your comments, your debates that you want to have with us. All of that is great. And here are different ways that you can be in touch. First, there's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram handles. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, you can head to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. and check out our show notes for this episode. You can check out our Anya Shiva, the Digital Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning. You can check out all sorts of stuff at JudaismUnbound.com. You can also, of course, email us at Dan@JudaismUnbound.com or Alex@JudaismUnbound.com. And we love it when people listening do take us up on any of those different options for being in touch. So the last thing that I'll say is that support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.